My name is Stephen Levinson. I'm a faculty member at California State University, Monterey Bay. I teach primarily in the Teledramatic Arts and Technology department. I've also taught first-year seminar, I've taught in the art department, I've taught classes all across campus. And one of the things I do at the university is I'm the Director of Acquisitions for the Fort Ord Museum and Archive, which is a group of faculty from various departments who are trying to maintain the memory of the space as a military base, even though it's now a university, and collect materials and memorabilia and memories of that whole period. My particular area of study in regards to Fort Ord is how what they did at Fort Ord was similar to what we do at the university pedagogically. In other words, what were the educational theories that they used at Fort Ord that are similar to the theories we use at CSUMB. And I've collected a number of materials and history relating to specifically Fort Ord as an educational institution. Fort Ord is a military base in Central California here in Monterey, one of the largest military bases in California. It was connected to its sister base down the coast, Fort Hunter Liggett. Between the two of them, they were the largest military base in California, certainly, and one of the largest in the United States. As a result, they were used for a number of things, one of which is primarily training. A lot of basic training and AIT, or advanced infantry training, went on here. Also a lot of testing of military equipment. Because of the huge areas of land, they were able to do basically troop trainings, large numbers of people at the same time, and experiment in new equipment, new tanks, new infantry. The headquarters were at Fort Ord. A lot of the actual experimentation went on at Fort Hunter Liggett. Fort Ord was primarily known as a training facility, basic training for the 6th Infantry, the 7th Infantry, a number of other infantries, primarily Army, through years of its entire existence. It started in 1917 when the American government bought a farm from the German family Giggling, who had owned the land previously. Originally it was called Camp Giggling, and there still is a Giggling Road and remnants of Giggling name throughout Fort Ord. It was eventually changed to Camp Ord, being named after General Edward Cresap Ord, who had been a Civil War general. He'd fought what are called the Indian Wars all across the West Coast and was based at the Presidio for many years. It was renamed Camp Ord in honor of General Ord and eventually became Fort Ord around 1938. During the time it existed, it's expected that at least 1.7 million people went through Fort Ord and did some kind of training here. It was one of the most important military bases on the West Coast, as well as economic bases for the local community. It was approximately the size of San Francisco, around 45 square miles, which allowed them to do many different things. They had numerous facilities for training. They had the whole nature area where they were able to do realistic, real-world sort of military structural training. They also had what's called the Impossible City, which was basically a cinder block city, which allowed them to do urban training. It was one of the first of its kind, built in the mid-60s. Now there are other versions of it all across the country. It was legally and officially called the Impossible City. The original designer originally wanted to name it after Baer, but wasn't allowed to. So he ended up suggesting the Impossible City, and that was the official legal name. That's actually still in operation. Many people use it to develop their understanding of urban warfare and urban police work. The Navy SEALs study there. Many city police departments practice there. It's actually run now by Monterey Peninsula College as a training facility primarily for police. As an area of basic training, Fort Ord developed a series of what I consider very advanced pedagogies. Or to use a civilian term, Fort Ord developed a series of very advanced styles of education, theories of education, because they had an extremely disparate group to work with. Their goal in basic training was to take a group of people who they didn't know. Especially previous to Volunteer Army, they had just a random group of people come in, forced to join the Army, and over a period of 8 weeks to 3 months, depending on the length of basic training and the reality of war at that time in history, they had to take this random group of people from various random backgrounds and turn them into an effective fighting unit. As an effective fighting unit, they needed a group of people who were very loyal to each other and who would be willing to kill, that being the primary need of an army in wartime. So they had to take a group of people and turn them into an effective fighting, killing unit, which is a very difficult thing to do. People don't naturally want to do that. And as a result, the military had to develop very extensive, complicated, and very advanced understandings of learning so that they could do that. And what they did is they used a number of very similar educational styles to what we now use at universities. They used an outcomes-based education, they used real-world training in very realistic environments. They were very conscious of the need to develop an understanding of attitude. They realized that there was no use in giving somebody the technical skills to use an M16 submachine gun if that person wasn't willing to use it, wasn't willing to fire it in time of need. Now, there have been a number of studies of armies throughout history which have shown that people don't really like to shoot other people. It was estimated that during World War I, about 15% of infantrymen actually shot somebody. By World War II, it was up to 50. By Vietnam, it was up to about 80%. So what had changed in that period of time? The basic nature of people hadn't changed. What had changed was the military's ability to train attitude. And they essentially developed more realistic training methods, which they used here at Fort Ord. Previous to World War II, for example, they would have pop-up targets which were just circles on sticks. No relationship to the reality of a human body. They eventually started to develop pop-up targets with the silhouette of a human body, and that was what you would practice on. As a result, when you're actually in the field in Vietnam, in a war, when in front of you appears that form, you have an automatic response to shoot it. So what they had done is they basically developed training methods so that people would respond appropriately. And they also did much in the way of attitude development. A critical element of the ability to shoot somebody in a war is to believe that they are an enemy, that they are an other, that they are different from you. So there is a constant training of that in basic and advanced training. You were constantly told and trained to be loyal to your immediate group, whatever that was, and in competition with another group. In basic training, that group is your troop. The group you're in competition with is the troop down the street. So you're constantly told that these are your brothers, these are the people you need to protect, you're the best troop in the army, you need to be better than them. Eventually that attitude of loyalty and competition would grow from the troop to the battalion, to the army, to the country. So eventually you would be a loyal member of your group and angry and competitive with that other, which ultimately would be whoever you're at war with, whether it's Vietnamese or Iraqi. One place that still stands officially in what's the land of Marina is the old stockade, which was the prison for Fort Ord. And there are a number of very important elements to that. There was a very famous case during Vietnam when a black soldier shot his white sergeant, a black man by the name of Billy Dean Smith. It became a very important nationally known case of fragging, where a soldier shoots one of their own leaders. That soldier was at Fort Ord in the stockade. One of the lieutenants who was in charge of the stockade for a period of time was a man by the name of Chris Christopherson, who had been a highly educated, college-degreed Rhodes Scholar and had actually gone to college in England for a period of time. So when he became a member of the Army, he automatically became a lieutenant as a result of his having a college degree. As a lieutenant, he was put in charge of something. And what he was put in charge of in this case was the stockade at Fort Ord. Chris Christopherson actually had his friend Willie Nelson come and visit at one point. This is all information I received from the drill sergeant, one of the staff sergeants at the stockade, who was in charge of the stockade. Another thing he told me is, being a prison, oftentimes people would try to escape. And they had, I believe, 3 towers around the stockade. In one of them, there's still remnants of a man who escaped, climbed up into one of the towers and shot himself in the tower. Allegedly, you can still see some of the blood on the walls. I mean, it was a prison. There were some pretty horrible things there. Another interesting thing about Fort Ord is, like many bases all across the country, there was actually fairly strong anti-war feeling during the Vietnam War. As with the rest of the country, some of the soldiers coming in who had been drafted didn't support the war. And they would actually, I know this from a person who had done this, organize anti-war marches. And they would have to get approval from the commander of Fort Ord in order to do that. But they did, on a number of occasions, actually get approval and have anti-war marches as soldiers during the Vietnam War. They would also put out, as did many other bases all across the country, actually anti-war newsletter. One of the ones here was called "Every Soldier is a POW." So there was actually a history of anti-war activity at Fort Ord. One really important element of attitude development at Fort Ord, which I'm particularly interested in as someone with an art degree and an art background myself, is the use of murals. Very important element of both artistic expression and attitude development were the use of murals. You can go through many of the old buildings still and find murals that were painted by soldiers during that period of time. One of my favorites was a room where PLDC occurred. PLDC is the Primary Leadership Development course. It was a critical step in the training of leaders in the Army. Unlike people like Chris Christopherson, who, because of their college degrees, automatically became lieutenants, not necessarily having much military history, PLDC was people who'd worked up through the ranks, probably starting as privates, having become sergeants or about to become sergeants, and are committing to becoming leaders at that very critical level of the Army. It's sort of the level of leadership that directly works with a group of soldiers. They're the people responsible for counseling, for training, for military theory, for education, for maintaining community and loyalty. It's an incredibly important level of control in the hierarchy of the Army, from general down to private. It's that sergeant that directly is responsible for a group of people. In order to become that person, you went through what was called different things at different times in history, but for a long time here, Primary Leadership Development course. In the room where they did that training, there's a whole series of murals. The training is very difficult. The expectation of knowledge is very high, and it's physically very demanding. So not everybody made it through. And virtually every one of the murals, which had been painted by a graduating group of students, had a list of the fallen, the people who didn't survive the training. Another room, which still exists, is called the War Room. It actually says the War Room when you walk into it. It has, among other things, a huge mushroom cloud in one mural with a soldier in front of it. It also has things like, and I quote, "War is nothing but a game. Want to play?" As with many of the murals, there's a strong emphasis in skulls, in blood, in knives, in guns, in the real potential of death. Not only death on the part of your enemy, but the reality of death as something that might happen to you. So the resistance to that was a real critical part of the training. In that particular gallery, there's another mural with sort of dripping red blood, which says, "We fight for free doom, let the enemy die for his country," which is also part of that attitude development. The murals were very much part of training the mentality of the soldier. And as a result, in some cases we're in the classroom, but in many cases we're in the living environment. In the barracks, there would be murals. Because one of the major differences between what a university does and what the military does is the amount of time they have to do it. As a faculty member at a university, you know, I may, if I'm lucky, have a student for 4 or 5 years. But during that time, I only have control over a certain element of their life, which is the time they're in class. I don't control what they eat, I don't control when they eat, I don't control how they sleep, I don't control what's on the wall in their sleeping environment. So we have sort of a loose, partial control for a long period of time. What the military had was a short period of time, but absolute control. They controlled what you ate, when you ate, what you looked at, what movies you saw, when you went to sleep, when you woke up, what you saw on the wall, what you saw on the stairs as you were walking up to your dorm room or barrack. There are a number of cases where on each staircase, as you're walking up to the barracks, there's an attitude, responsibility, loyalty, and at least one sense of humor was listed as an important element. So just walking up the stairs to go to sleep, you'd be seeing things that the Army wanted you to see. So the military totally controlled your entire sensory environment for a fairly short period of time. But they very effectively used that period of time both to train you in technical skills and to develop your attitude so that you would apply those technical skills appropriately. Because of fewer wars and many other reasons, the American government decided to start closing certain bases in the early 90s. And it was a very complicated, difficult process because local communities very often were dependent on the military base as a large chunk of their economy. Roughly 30% of the city of Marina disappeared when Fort Ord closed down. As a result, Marina lost 30% of its economic base. That fact was important, and the fact that a lot of the local community was military, had come here because of Fort Ord, moved into the local community, and were very emotionally connected to Fort Ord as an institution. So they did not want it to close. They were not generally happy that a university was coming here. They didn't know what that meant. They didn't know who these people were. They just knew that these people were taking up the military space that they had previously been in love with and loyal to. Around '94, it was officially closed. People coming here, the original 22 founding faculty of California State University, Monterey Bay, were then given about 8 months to create a university. This is much less than a normal university has. Other universities often have 4 to 10 years to develop their entire structure. They had 8 months. And they weren't quite able to complete it. In fact, when the first group of students showed up, the paint hadn't dried, and the buildings weren't complete, and there were no dorms to put them in. So what they did is they sent them on a camping trip for 2 weeks. And the first group of students just left for 2 weeks while the paint dried, and they put locks on the doors. And that became a tradition at the university of originally totally out of need, but ultimately out of an intent to help the students bond, to develop a community at the university. After about 6 years, the numbers were just too much to make that a reality. So we actually stopped doing that. But in the early years, a lot of the students felt that that's what really made them develop a connection to the university and a loyalty with their other students. Since then, it's been a little harder for us to develop community. And recently, we've started to develop a process called cohorts, or the higher ground system. And what this is a group of students come in and are designed to develop community with themselves. They will live together in a certain part of a dorm. They will have multiple classes together. They're designed to be loyal to each other, define their own community, and have a relationship, therefore, with the broader community. What does that sound like? It sounds like a troop. So in some ways, we've actually gone back to the traditions of Fort Ord of having small groups develop loyalty so that they can develop a loyalty to the larger group, which back then was the Army and is now California State University, Monterey Bay. So unconsciously almost, people at the university are sort of imitating what they did back then. This was one of the first times in the country that a military base was turned into a space of higher education. It was considered very important nationally. The Pentagon originally fought it, and then eventually they had no choice. It was done largely on the backs and hearts of Sylvia and Leon Panetta. Some people say Sylvia was more responsible than Leon for making it happen. But because of Panetta's importance locally and nationally, Chief of Staff to Clinton, and a hugely important national Democratic figure, they were able to make it work. Of the 45 square miles of Fort Ord, about 1,200 acres became CSUMB. The rest of it was divided by a number of different entities, making ownership of land at Fort Ord an extremely complicated issue. A large chunk of it became Bureau of Land Management, which is federal territory owned by the federal government as a nature reserve. The airport and parts of it went to the city of Marina, the golf course and other parts of it went to the city of Seaside. Some of it's county, some of it's unincorporated. It sort of split up into a number of areas. And there still is a very strong military base there. National Guard as well as some Army is still there. And the former hospital of Fort Ord has become what's called DMDC, the Defense Manpower Data Center. It's one of the two entities in the country that maintain all military data. Of all the millions and millions of people who've gone through the Army, all their medical records, all their histories, there are two centers of that, one of which is DMDC. Here it used to be Fort Ord in the old hospital. Most of the buildings at CSUMB are converted from old military bases. In some cases, they're fairly partial conversions. My office is on the first floor of an old basic training unit, and the 2 floors above me are completely unused. There's old beds and lamps and military paraphernalia. So there's actually only the lower floor has been changed. We've only officially built, at this point, 3 new buildings on the entire campus, or the Alumni Center, the library, and the new science building. Everything else has been converted. The original science building had been a dental clinic while it was Fort Ord. Very few of the buildings of Fort Ord still remain. There are elements of Fort Ord still throughout the space and certainly throughout the entire area that was Fort Ord. Along the coast, you still have the bunkers. There used to be essentially 2 areas of training ranges where people learned how to shoot guns, pistols, rifles. You had the coastal ranges, and then you had the ranges out in what's now Bureau of Land Management land. So in the coastal area, where the original Stillwell Hall used to stand, it's now become Dunes National Park. It's now officially a state park. The bunkers still exist. Some of the towers still exist. The organization at CSUMB that's trying to maintain this history is called the Fort Ord Museum and Archive. I'm the Director of Acquisitions. There are a number of other members from different departments all across campus who are really dedicated to honoring that history. We feel that it was an incredibly important element of the history of Monterey County. It's incredibly important in the military history, especially of the West Coast. Every war from World War I up through Panama had a major element coming out of Fort Ord. So in our desire to really honor that memory, we've started FOMA, Fort Ord Museum and Archive. We're developing a collection of actual materials, which we hope to build into a real museum. We're looking at a number of possible spaces. There's the possibility of maintaining one of the old barracks as it was, either during World War II or Vietnam era, preferably both, and actually taking all the materials we've collected, documentation, photographs, maps, training materials, yearbooks, uniforms, boots, medals of various kinds, collecting all this very important memorabilia and actually presenting it in official museum space at some time.